Calloway's boot connected with Serrano's rifle case, hard enough to send it sliding across the motor pool. Floor, the metal clasps catching the overhead light as it spun and stopped against the far wall. Nobody said anything. Serrano stood at her vehicle, one hand still on the door handle, and watched it happen. She had been reaching for her gear. She had been mid-motion. Now she stood completely still, the way a person goes still not from shock but from calculation. The kind of stillness that asks, very quietly, what happens next depends entirely on what I do right now. Calloway was already walking away. Wrong spot, he said without turning around. That's where we stage equipment that matters. There were 4 other men in that motor pool. Not one of them looked up. That was the moment. Not the boot. Not the equipment. The 4 men who found something very important to do with their eyes. In the exact second, it would have cost them nothing to acknowledge what had just happened. Serrano noticed all 5. She filed each one carefully, the way she filed everything, and she picked up her rifle case and found another spot, and she didn't say a word. She had learned early that words cost more than they returned. Staff Sergeant Elena Serrano had come to 3rd Special Forces Support Battalion through a combination of performance records that her previous command described, in official documentation, as anomalous. The word had been meant as a compliment. It had not felt like one. Anomalous meant outside the expected distribution. It meant she had done things the model did not predict for someone with her profile, by which they meant her gender, by which they would never say that directly. She was 29 years old. She had been shooting since she was 7, when her father, retired Marine gunnery sergeant, 2 tours in Fallujah, a man of almost no words who communicated primarily through demonstration, had taken her to a range outside of Tucson and handed her a .22 rifle and said nothing at all. Just watched. She had picked it up, and she had looked down the sights, and she had done what felt natural, which was to breathe out and wait and squeeze. Her father had looked at her for a long moment after the first group of shots. Again, he said, she shot for 4 hours that first day. She would have stayed longer. Her father, Gunnery Sergeant Victor Serrano, USMC retired, had been dead for 3 years by the time she arrived at the battalion. A massive stroke sudden, the way they sometimes are in men who never let anything show on the outside because everything had been stored, carefully and catastrophically, within. She had gotten the call while she was completing her 3rd rotation as a JTAC attached to a Ranger battalion, calling in airstrikes from a rooftop in a city she wasn't supposed to be in, technically, under rules of engagement that had been written by someone who had never been on a rooftop in that city. She had finished the mission. She had grieved on the flight home, privately, in the dark of a C-17, in a way that left no evidence. She did not talk about her father. But everything about the way she moved, the way she assessed, the way she never flinched from discomfort, and never mistook silence for safety, all of it was him. Calloway did not know any of this. Calloway knew that she had arrived at his unit with paper qualifications that he had looked at once and set aside, because in his experience, paper qualifications for women in this line of work were outcomes of a system working too hard to prove something. He knew she was assigned as a sniper and reconnaissance specialist, which he found, privately, a little absurd. He had run his assessment of her in the first 3 minutes of their introduction and had filed the result under administrative burden and moved on. His name was Master Sergeant Dale Calloway. He was 41, 15 years in special operations, a man whose confidence had been built through genuine competence and had then, somewhere along the way, calcified into something that no longer updated on new information. He was not a bad soldier. He was, in the specific way that causes the most damage, a very good soldier who had stopped learning. The unit was 2 weeks out from a training exercise, a joint evaluation with a Delta detachment out of Bragg, a multi-day field assessment in the mountains of eastern Washington that was designed to test surveillance, target acquisition, and deep reconnaissance under austere conditions. The kind of exercise where careers either confirmed themselves or quietly derailed. Serrano had been preparing for 6 weeks. Calloway had made the preparation difficult in the way that experienced people make things difficult for those they've dismissed. Not through direct obstruction, which would create a record, but through the slower erosion of small things. The range time that was available until she requested it formally, at which point it had been allocated elsewhere. The equipment requests that moved through administrative processing at a pace that suggested a system working normally, but somehow never arriving. The briefings that started 2 minutes before she was notified of the time, none of it was anything you could point to. All of it accumulated. Serrano requested range time through two separate channels and used both of them. She sourced her own ammunition through a supply sergeant in a different company who owed her a favor from a logistics situation she had resolved quietly 18 months prior. She arrived at briefings 8 minutes early and stood outside the door until someone opened it. She did not complain about any of this. She had learned something in her years in the Army, which was that complaint redirects energy from the problem to the presentation of the problem, and she did not have energy to spare. Her shooting platform for the exercise was a Mk-21 precision sniper rifle, chambered in .338 Norma Magnum, a weapon that was in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, capable of consistent first-round hits at distances that most shooters would describe as aspirational rather than practical. Calloway had made a comment about it in the motor pool the day before the incident with the case, something about how that particular weapons system required a certain feel for long-range ballistics that took years to develop properly. He had said it to the man standing next to Serrano, not to her. She had said nothing then either. There was a lot that Serrano held in silence. People who did not know her sometimes mistook this for passivity. The people who did know her, and they were few, but they were loyal in the specific way that respect generates loyalty, understood it for what it was. She was running a longer calculation than most people in her vicinity were aware of. The exercise began on a Tuesday, in weather that had decided to make everyone's life as instructive as possible. Low ceiling, intermittent rain, temperatures that sat in that particular band, where you are never quite warm and never quite cold enough for the discomfort to clarify into something useful. The Delta detachment arrived in 2 vehicles, 8 men, the kind of quiet that comes not from shyness, but from people who have been doing serious things long enough that performance no longer interests them. Their OIC was a captain named Hess, early 30s, sparse with words, the kind of face that gave nothing away and had probably never given anything away. Serrano clocked him immediately. Hess, she noted, was the type who would watch before he decided. That was useful information. The first day was movement, 12 kilometers through terrain that was technically mapped but practically hostile. Gaining elevation through a ridgeline that offered no kindness and a lot of loose shale, and the specific misery of a ruck that gets heavier with each hour, not because anything is added, but because the body begins negotiating with itself about what is actually necessary. Calloway ran the patrol line. Serrano was mid-element. She moved without complaint, at pace, with the Mk-21 in addition to her standard load, an additional 9 pounds that nobody had mentioned and nobody had offered to redistribute. Midway through the movement, one of the Delta operators, a Sergeant Greer, built like a man who had made a long-term commitment to being useful, moved up alongside her on a switchback and glanced at her load. He didn't say anything. He noted it, filed it. That was all. She would remember that later. The first night was a hide site overlooking a valley that the exercise controllers had designated as a target area, a mock enemy communications node, defended by an OP-4 element that had been given a week's head start to set up. The task was surveillance and target development over a 48-hour window, building a targeting package from concealed positions without compromising the hide. Serrano was assigned secondary observer. Calloway had put himself on the primary glass. She did not object. Secondary observer in a 2-person surveillance team has responsibilities that are no less demanding and in some ways more technically intensive than primary. She settled into her position, slowed her breathing, and began to work. The first 6 hours were silence. Real silence, the kind that the body initially rebels against, and then, if you are patient enough, begins to sink into. The mind quiets. The field of view narrows and simultaneously sharpens. Peripheral distraction drops away. At hour 7, Serrano noticed something. There was a pattern in the OP-4 movement around the southern perimeter of the node. A gap of approximately 4 minutes between rotations on the western approach, consistent, reliable, suggesting either poor planning or deliberate deception. She tracked it for 90 minutes before she was certain it was consistent. She passed it to Calloway in the voice that surveillance teams use, the one that has no extra words in it. Calloway noted it and said nothing further. At the shift change, she logged the observation in the targeting record. Calloway's entry for that period read, Southern perimeter pattern under assessment. She read it twice, then she added her specific timing, data, signed it, and continued working. On the second day, the weather descended. The ceiling came down to approximately 400 feet, which in mountain terrain does not mean reduced visibility so much. as it means a fundamental reorganization of the sensory landscape. Distance collapses, sound changes. The reference points that a shooter uses to build ballistic solutions become uncertain in ways that require recalculation from first principles rather than adjustment of established data. Most shooters in these conditions extend their timelines. They build in additional observation. They wait for the window to open. Serrano had been building solutions for the full range of expected conditions since the exercise briefing. She had worked the environmental variables for this specific terrain at this specific time of year, pulling historical weather data for the valley and running her ballistic software through the full spread. She had paper solutions for 7 different meteorological scenarios. She had committed the 2 most likely to memory. When the ceiling dropped, she did not extend her timeline. She adjusted her solution and continued. He didn't say so directly, but there was a shift in the quality of his silence, from the silence of a man who has already decided something to the silence of a man who is revising. The exercise's primary evaluation event was a timed target engagement, a sequence of 3 targets at graduated distances, 2 of which required first-round solutions under time constraint, the third of which was a cold-bore shot at distance that would test both preparation and execution under the accumulated physical and mental stress of 2 days in the field. The distances were 600 meters, 940 meters, and 1,200 meters. The 200-meter target in these conditions was a problem that many experienced snipers would approach with significant margin for doubt. Serrano lay behind the Mk-21 and did not feel doubt. She felt the weight of the system against her shoulder, the familiar architecture of the stock and the grip, and the cold of the metal through her shooting glove. She felt the ground beneath her, the specific irregularities of the terrain that she had spent 20 minutes mapping when she settled into position, ensuring she had bone support and natural point of aim before she touched anything else. She thought briefly about her father on a range outside Tucson, the way he had watched, the way he had said again. She pressed her cheek to the stock. The first target disappeared at 600 meters, 1 round. Greer, downrange on the evaluation team, marked it without expression and radioed back. The 940-meter target required a wind hold. The valley was generating a left-to-right push that her meter read at approximately 9 miles per hour with gust variation, which meant she was not holding for the number, but for the pattern, timing the gust cycle and releasing between peaks. She waited 11 seconds, then she fired. The radio crackled. The target was marked. For the 1,200-meter shot, the field went quiet. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of people paying close attention. She had run this solution twice in her head before she got behind the glass. She had the drop, the wind, the temperature correction, the density-altitude adjustment. She had the position dialed. There was nothing left to do except execute, which is the part that cannot be rehearsed, only performed. She breathed out. Half breath, hold. The trigger broke cleanly. A long pause. The kind of pause that exists between a decision and its consequence, when there is nothing to do but accept what happens next. Then Greer's voice on the radio, deliberate, giving nothing away. Target hit. First round. Nobody said anything dramatic. This was not a movie. There was no slow clap, no moment where Calloway walked over and extended his hand with his eyes full of changed understanding. What happened was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure. Subtle, real. Hess, the Delta captain, walked over to the position where Serrano was clearing her weapon and preparing to exfil. He stood beside her and looked out at the range for a moment. Then he said, "Where'd you train?" "My father," she said, mostly. Hess nodded, the way someone nods when an answer confirms something they had already begun to think. What was his background? Marine. Gunny. Fallujah. Twice. Another nod. Hess looked at the valley for one more moment, then said, "Good glass work on the southern perimeter gap. The timing data saved us 4 hours of back planning." He walked back to his element. That was all he said. It was in the specific calculus of people who operate at that level, significant. Greer said even less. He passed Serrano on the movement back to the vehicles and gave her a single nod, the kind that, in that context, carries a weight that hours of conversation would not. Calloway was quiet for most of the movement out. He was running something internally, had been since the radio crackdown, and Serrano did not need him to complete that process out loud. She knew what the process was. She had watched it happen in men before him, the recalibration that occurs when information arrives that doesn't match the model, and the model is honest enough to update. He wasn't a man who would apologize. She hadn't expected one and didn't need it. What she needed, she had demonstrated. What the record would show, it now showed. 3 weeks after the exercise, Serrano received a selection notification from the unit's targeting cell, a specialized billet that placed her in a role supporting long-range target development for the battalion's most sensitive operations. The position had been created in the aftermath of the evaluation, based on a recommendation that came through official channels from Captain Hess. Calloway signed the paperwork. She did not know what it had cost him to do it. She suspected it had not been nothing. Men who have made their determinations early do not revise them comfortably. But he had signed it, and in the architecture of military bureaucracy, the signature was the thing that mattered. She was issued a new equipment set. She had a range allocation without caveat. She had a seat at briefings that started at the time listed in the notification. She spent her first evening in the new billet doing what she always did. What her father had done, what she had learned from watching him in the quiet after Fallujah, in the years when he was technically home but still processing what home meant. She cleaned her weapon. She checked her data. She sat in the particular stillness that is not emptiness but preparation, the stillness of a person who is not waiting for permission to be what they already are, who has simply been waiting for the field to open. Outside, the range was dark, and the mountains were dark, and the stars over eastern Washington were very bright and very old, and entirely indifferent to what happened below them. Serrano field-stripped the Mk-21 with her eyes closed, the way her father had taught her. You do it in the dark so that in the dark it is still done. And she laid each component in order, and she cleaned each one carefully, and she put it back together, and it was right. She set it down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about her father, who had never said much, who had communicated in the register of demonstration and silence, and again, who had been in his way the most eloquent person she had ever known. She thought he would have appreciated the 200-meter shot. Not the drama of it, not what it meant to the men who had watched it, just the execution, the breath, the hold, the break, the fundamental privacy of a thing done correctly. She thought he might have said, again. She turned off the light.